Welcome to Book TV's Afterwards. Alan Beatty, eminent journalist and economist and historian as well, has written a fascinating book sort of covering everything from ancient Egypt to the current times and in the economic trends that have prevailed and have taken hold. And I think he finds quite a few things that are common with today and ancient Egypt and even ancient Rome. And it's a fascinating book. The title of the book, False Economy, that's the part that actually kind of puzzles me the most, and I thought I would just ask you, why did you write the book, and what is the meaning of the title?
Well, the meaning of the title, and the title, as often with books, is pretty much the last thing we came up with, was because I think there were lots of false ideas that go around about the economy, and a lot of false ideas that have gone around about human history. The most prominent one being that things that were going to happen are always inevitable, that we are where we are, and there's nothing really very much we can do about it. Some countries are rich, some countries are poor, and that's just the way things are. Some countries are always destined to be rich, and some countries are always destined to be poor. And I kind of regard that as a false economy of thought. And I think it's one of the problems when you're just trying to explain where things are at the moment, to say, well, let's look back into history, let's explain why we've got things are, and then, okay, that was it. There's nothing that anyone could have done about it anywhere along. So really what I was trying to challenge is the idea that economic history is destiny, or economic history is fate, and that we can't control. We couldn't have controlled the past, and that we can't control the future.
Well, you do an excellent job with that. I think making very clear what is kind of baked in the cake, and that we are given when we start out, but also what kind of choices are made, and those who make the good choices and those who make the bad choices. His first chapter, I think, is one of particular interest to Americans because it sort of asks a question that I think probably has occurred to a lot of people in this country. Why did we turn out so different from South America? And you take the example of Argentina. Essentially, the two continents were discovered at roughly the same time, and they had the same blank sheet, blank page to be written on by the Europeans who came. The United States has fertile land, arable land, and wonderful resources, but so did Argentina and Brazil and so on. And so you discuss why it is that Argentina ended up being still part of the poor developing world today, whereas the United States became the biggest, richest economy on earth. Can you kind of go through that and how all of that happened, starting with from the very beginning? Sure,
and in some ways it's even more dramatic than that. It's not just Argentina was always poor and stayed poor, but that Argentina became rich, and that between the wars, Argentina was one of the 10 richest economies on earth. And then it fell. It's, as the old saying goes, it's just about the only economy that's ever managed to get from the third world to the first and then back again. So the question is, why did it do that? Well, from the beginning, the way in which Argentina developed and the way in which it settled its frontier was very different from the US. As you say, both of them are very similar. They have these big fertile grasslands, you know, the pampas and the prairie. But the US did it in a kind of quite entrepreneurial way. It parceled out land to small amounts of land to entrepreneurial farmers who really wanted to make a go of it and increase productivity. Argentina, possibly because of the legacy of being part of the Spanish Empire, essentially recreated a kind of European landowning aristocracy in the New World. They parceled out huge swathes of land, often fairly arbitrarily, often to military officers who'd done the conquering, but they didn't necessarily want to farm it. They weren't that interested in farming it or doing anything kind of innovative with it. All they really did was to encircle huge swathes of it with barbed wire and turn it over to pasture. And so that was kind of one of the early missteps that Argentina did, and from then on, Argentina began to be kind of run by a fairly small kind of oligarchy, a small landowning oligarchy. They weren't very interested in industrializing. They weren't very interested in saving their own money and investing it in industry. And while the US had this sort of go-ahead entrepreneurial class who saved their own money, certainly they borrowed it from abroad, and they imported, you know, technology and know-how from Britain and elsewhere. But they were very interested in whatever the newest thing was, and industrializing. And Argentina really wasn't. And that was the first kind of initial misstep, I think, that put Argentina on a different path to the US. And then, for a while, that was kind of masked the big differences between the two weren't that obvious, because Argentina was just doing so well pumping out food exports, you know, the wheat and the beef and so forth. But all it really was a glorified export zone. It wasn't really a kind of, you know, standalone economy on its own. The Brits poured money and expertise into Argentina, but all they really wanted to do was just get out the wheat and get out the beef. They didn't really want to kind of build the country up. And then when the Great Depression hit, that affected Argentina enormously, because of course it was agricultural trade that was one of the biggest things to be hit, one of the biggest casualties of the Great Depression. And then where the US kind of renewed itself and democracy was tested but survived, and the federal government changed some of the things it did, and so forth, Argentina unfortunately slid into dictatorship, and it slid also into isolationism. And the idea that Argentina came away with from the Great Depression was entirely the wrong one. It was basically, we relied on the rest of the world let us down, we're not going to do that anymore. What we're going to do is build ourselves up behind tariff walls, we're going to cut ourselves off, we're going to be, you know, isolationist, and we're going to be self-sufficient. And that really was not a recipe for becoming a rich country. And that's the moment at which some of the early mistakes that Argentina made became very obvious, and Argentina began to slide from the third world to the first world back to the third.
Yes, that is what's fascinating, is I think a lot of people don't even realize Argentina was one of the top 10 richest countries in the world like a century ago, and lost its place because of some bad decisions made during the, I guess primarily you're saying the Great Depression was sort of the defining event, where the United States certainly had trouble, but ultimately over a very troubled period made the right decisions as far as adjustments in its economy, adjustments in the government and regulation of the economy, whereas Argentina went to an extreme and was not able to really pick itself up and succeed after that in the way it had started out. And it's interesting, as you say, also that the British played, I think, an equally important role in both countries' development, providing financing, providing capital and expertise, but it was the Americans that took that and sort of ran with it and mastered it themselves and became industrialized, while the Argentinians were, in a sense, resting on their laurels and just staying an agricultural state primarily. So that's a fascinating chapter, and I guess helps to really define as you lay it out, what you're given, what you start out with, and what you can make of it as a country and as an economy. I thought also what your discussion of the Egyptians and how they were at one time the breadbasket of the world, which I think is also eye-opening to a lot of people. The breadbasket of the ancient world, of course, the Romans bread. But then, of course, today are unable to feed 80 million people because the population has grown so much. Can you explain all that and how that came to be and sort of the significance of that for a modern economy?
This is just essentially a question of trade, in that during the ancient times, because the effective trading range for goods like grain, which were sort of kind of quite bulky and low value and so forth, was the Mediterranean. You know, so within the Mediterranean during the Roman times, Egypt had more water than anyone else because they had the Nile, right? And you know, they had for millennia had the Nile, and they'd worked out how to irrigate and how to deal with kind of irregular floods and so forth, and turn themselves into you know, quite a well-ordered and stable society. I mean, the fact that they could spare all the people to build the pyramids and so forth, and indeed produce enough grain surplus to feed ancient Rome as well, was testament to that. And so at that point it made absolute sense. You know, Egypt was better at growing grain pretty much than anyone else within the Mediterranean. But then, as technology changed, and as we now have shipping containers and, you know, huge ocean-going vessels, the effective range of trade in grain is the entire world. It's not the Mediterranean anymore. And so Egypt might have more water than anyone else in the Mediterranean, but it certainly doesn't have more water than anyone else in the world. And once you brought in countries like the Ukraine, Canada, the US, Australia, Argentina, actually, which have a lot of water that that doesn't derive from the Nile, but falls from the sky in the form of rain, it's much more efficient for them to grow grain and for Egypt to import grain. It's a simple question of comparative advantage. But implicitly what's going on here is really water. What Egypt looks like it's doing is trading grain. Really what they're doing is trading water. Because if they really wanted to, they could just import, hundreds and hundreds of 40-foot containers of fresh water, and they could grow grain in the desert themselves if they wanted to. But that's not a very efficient way of doing it. A far more efficient way of doing it is saying, instead of importing the water, let's import things that are made or grown with that water. So implicitly, they're importing water. And this is a lovely idea that an academic came up with of embedded water or virtual water. So he said, and the great thing about this is that it's actually just the free market that does it. You don't need a treaty. You don't need any teams of international bureaucrats. You don't need world government. You just need the market. All you need to do is price water properly. So in countries where it's scarce, it should have a high price. In countries where it's less scarce, it should have a lower price. And then let the market work. And so that's why Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world and is now the world's largest importer of grain. The question that I start that chapter is, why does Egypt import half its staple food? And the answer I end up coming up with is, the question isn't really, why does it import half its staple food? It's why doesn't it import more? Actually, why do they actually still to this day use some of the water, some of the very scarce water that comes down the Nile, to grow some of their own grain, when in fact it would be much more efficient if they used it for other things and then continue to import grain. So that's just a way of kind of demonstrating theories of comparative advantage and why countries that have a lot of a particular resource, whether it's water or whether it's land or whether it's people or whatever, should kind of specialize in that and then trade with countries that have more resources in something else.
And it's fascinating, although the way you highlight how you can go from being a country that has the water and the land and the resources to being the one that really doesn't vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And in the long history of Egypt, they've had a complete reversal, and I'm sure other nations are going through the same kind of transitions. The issue of water is an interesting one I'd like to dwell on, because it seems like that is getting to be and will be an even more important issue as time goes on, as the population grows, and much of the world's population seems to be in these very dry areas. There's talk of water shortages. How do you see that working out? I mean, will they be able to import their water through food and other things and succeed, or will we see any kind of a crisis developing?
Well, if the world trading system remains open and free, yes, they should absolutely be able to import it. And this talk about water and this cliche that the wars of the moment are about oil, but the next war will be about water. People have been saying this for decades. People have been saying the Middle East will have wars over water for decades, and there were conflict over water between Jordan and Israel and Syria, back in the 1960s, and yet it actually just hasn't happened. It hasn't happened in the Middle East. There hasn't been a war over water in the Middle East, and one of the reasons is that countries have increasingly let this logic of comparative advantage play out, and they have increasingly imported their water embedded in food. These calculations that these academics have done say that a lot of the countries in the Middle East, certainly Jordan, which is a kind of quite small dry country, ceased to be able to become self-sufficient in food decades ago. I mean, if they had to grow all the food, they just couldn't. They don't have the water to do it. And yet there haven't particularly been water wars in Jordan, there haven't particularly been water riots in Jordan, because they have been able to import their food. Now, one of the difficult things about this is that this relies on there always being food to import, and that it relies on there being a global market in food. And one of the disturbing things that we saw over the past couple of years with the food crisis, when the price of food spiked, is that it suddenly looked like there wasn't going to be enough food there. I mean, Egypt itself banned exports of rice. It grows some of its own rice, and the price of rice spiked 30% in a single day. And to be fair to countries like this, if you're going to take the risk of saying we'll import our food, you need the food always to be there to import. And that's one of the reasons I think that it's so important to have international organizations, and organizations like the World Trade Organization, because they kind of marry the importers and the exporters. And to those countries which might have been inclined to say, we must grow our own food, we must grow our own food no matter what. If an organisation like the WTO can say to them, look, there will always be food on the world market for you to buy, that gives them some confidence, and they're therefore able to let comparative advantage play out and use their water for something else. If that food isn't there, of course, then there's a problem. And one of the really unfortunate things I think we saw during the food crisis is that countries, at the same time, they were desperately trying to import as much food as possible, you know, and cutting their trade barriers against food and so on just in the short term. At the same time, in the longer term, we're saying we must now be self-sufficient in food. The lesson of this is we can't rely on the world markets. And so you had countries like the Philippines, which is a very crowded country, you know, and not really a particularly good place for growing food, saying we want to be self-sufficient in rice for 2 years. Now, you know, I've seen rice farms in the Philippines. They're right up in the mountains. They're all cut into kind of rice terraces in the mountains. It's a very inefficient and expensive way to grow rice. Nonetheless, they're so obsessed with self-sufficiency and they're so untrusting of the world market that they say, you know, we'd rather take that inefficiency, we'd rather pay a lot more for rice as long as we can guarantee we can grow it ourselves. And that was one of the really unfortunate outcomes, I think, of that particular episode.
I was going to ask you, how would you evaluate that? It seems like, did the World Trade Organization or any of these international organizations, I guess you have the World Food Program, played a very important role in ameliorating that crisis for some of the countries that were hit the hardest. But did the world rise to the occasion, or were there kind of, as you say, some developments that portend badly for the future? One of the things is, I get the impression that the crisis ended mostly because of the collapse in commodity prices that occurred when the credit crisis set in, and the rest in the world fell into recession the middle of last year, rather than as a result of our concerted efforts through the World Trade Organization or whatever to prevent the crisis from worsening by government action. But what was your evaluation? Did we make any progress there, or were there some warning signs that we may have another food problem, a food crisis to deal with in the future when the economy starts picking up again?
Yeah, unfortunately not. I agree entirely with you. I don't think any progress was made at all. I mean, the World Food Programme and other kind of humanitarian agencies whose role is essentially just to do short-term famine relief, you know, they did their best. But their role is not to design a long-run trading system. And one of the things I found really remarkable, having covered world trade talks for a number of years now, is that during the food crisis, countries like the Philippines and India and so forth, at the same time that they were cutting their own immediate barriers to food trade, were arguing even more vociferously that they should be allowed to raise them again in the future. And if and when the world economy does recover, I think there's a very good chance we will see another food crisis 3 or 5 years down the line, because I don't think those lessons kind of were learned at all. I mean, one of the kind of wider points I make in the book is that, you know, reform is hard. Okay, if reform were easy, then I wouldn't need to write books like this, right? And, you know, the reason that world governments haven't reformed isn't just because they haven't read my book yet. It's because getting reform done is enormously difficult. You're often fighting against entrenched special interests, and you're fighting against ideologies and so forth. But there are certain times in which reform is much easier than others, and in particular at times of crisis. Okay, and there was this expression which I think I'd only heard maybe once until about a year ago, and now here in Washington I hear it about every other day, which is a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. You know, when crisis hits, a lot of things become possible that weren't possible before. I mean, just going back into history, one of the kind of the greatest changes, I think, the biggest shifts ever in policies to do with trade and food was in my own country, in Britain, in the middle of the 19th century, when a set of laws called the Corn Laws, which were essentially a big system of agricultural protection, were repealed. And that was a really pivotal shift when Britain said, we're not going to be an agricultural country anymore, we're going to be a manufacturing country. We're not going to hold up food prices in order to benefit landowners. We're going to have cheap food because that will mean lower costs for factory workers. And, you know, reform had been coming for a long time. But one of the ways in which reform finally got through was there was a gigantic food crisis. This is, in fact, exactly the same food crisis that caused famine in Ireland. And one of the reasons that Boston and New York are now largely Irish, became largely Irish cities, or the those Irish people that survived that dreadful famine often emigrated. But it was that kind of imperative and that disaster that caused the government to say, do you know something? We now need cheap food. We can't hold the price of food up anymore. We need to become a country that permanently has a policy of cheap food. And it was exploiting that crisis that caused them to be able to repeal the Corn Laws. And as I say, one of the biggest changes in trade policy the world has ever seen. And that was an opportunity that was seized. Unfortunately, the last couple of years with the food crisis was an opportunity I think was comprehensively missed.
Not seized. In fact, it was quite notable that there was no progress made in the World Trade talks on the very issue of food and agriculture, which has been the sticking point for years now, even in the middle of this food crisis, when it would seem like it was obvious then we needed a more rational system of trade in food. So I can see why you think that not much has been solved. And in fact, you did see some on the supplier side also. You saw some rather bad things happen, like Argentina starting to export its, tax exports of food, even though it's a major provider of staple foods to the rest of the world. And yet during this crisis, they actually started taxing their food exports.
Absolutely. I mean, this is Argentina doing the same silly things they've been doing for over a century. And in the middle of this, I mean, in the middle of this crisis, Argentina, one of the great beef-growing nations of the world. I mean, people who were in Buenos Aires at the time told me that in many cases there was no beef in the supermarket. Right? They filled up the meat counters in the supermarkets with pasta because they'd imposed all these taxes on exports, and the farmers simply reacted by going on strike and saying we're not going to, we're not going to have our income stolen from us. And so, at a time when Argentina should have been benefiting enormously, because the one thing that they were very good at doing, the price had gone up, instead of which production ground to a halt in the country, and the country was at each other's throats.
Certainly, you have documented very well how we're able to sort of blow the opportunities that are given us by doing things like that. So really, it's a very interesting history of the trade around the world that you bring about, and the influence that religion may or may not have. I think that a lot of people do tend to think that religion plays an important role somehow in our economy or how we end up. You've had this idea, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, that somehow the puritanical spirit that we have in the United States is something that helped us become a powerful industrialized nation. But then you really kind of bat that down quite a bit, and you acknowledge a role that the religion plays and cultural elements play generally in the economy, but that generally it's more a result of the interplay of the power elites with and how they use religion to solidify their control, perhaps, and so on. Going back to Argentina, just for simplicity, I mean, I think that a lot of people have thought that the Catholic Church has, the influence of the Catholic Church was an important factor that held South America back versus the Protestant ethic, which is a more individualized work ethic and rewards for effort and so on in the North American sphere. But you didn't find that particularly to be the case, did you?
I don't think so. No. I mean, if you look at what the thinking of Puritan theologians actually was, and indeed even once they'd pitched up in North America, the thinking of the Massachusetts colony. They had a whole bunch of restrictions on private enterprise, which would, struggle to make it into the Harvard Business School. They often invade against the false idea, as somebody said at the time, that a commodity is worth as much as somebody will pay for it. The early colonists set limits on interest rates. They set limits on prices. They disapproved of profiteering, and in many cases they wanted to live actually kind of quite an ascetic, non-material life, away from the profit motive and away from the desire to gain wealth. I mean, I think probably a kind of more power-centered, if you like, a more materialist kind of view of the role of religion, which is that if you look at individual religions and if you look at the kind of theology of individual religions, it's really hard to trace through any link from that to the societies that actually believe in them. Everyone believes that there's this prohibition on lending money at interest in the Quran, for example, which is why I focused that particular chapter on Islam. And that's not really true. I mean, it's not true in the theology, and it's certainly not true in the practice at the time. Indeed, if anything, there's a stronger prohibition on money lending within Christianity than there is within Islam. And I think really what matters with religion is not what the particular theology says, but just the role that that religion can play in any given society. What I would say was instrumental in turning North America into this thriving, free-thinking, capitalist, individualistic society was not really the fact that some of the early colonists were Puritans, but that if you didn't like it, you could go and found a religion, or you can found a colony somewhere else. If you didn't like the stifling conformity of Massachusetts, right, you can go and find Rhode Island, or you could go to found Pennsylvania. And one of the most important things I think about the Protestant Reformation within Europe, it wasn't that it succeeded and it wasn't that it failed, it's that it half succeeded. I think that was it. The best thing about it was that it half succeeded. And so it created, not a new society run on entirely different lines, but it created this sense of plurality, that there were different decisions that you could take, there were different routes you could take, there were different ways to the truth, there were different ways of thinking about things. And by challenging the primacy of any given one religious authority and one religious theology, it let people come up with their own ideas. And it also meant that when merchants and traders and so on and so forth began to grow as organized groups, they were able to have inconvenient laws, inconvenient religious rules and so on disposed of without threatening the entire basis of a society. I think that's the most important thing about the way that religion works. It's not what the religion itself says, it's the way that it's used by authorities within any given country.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll continue this conversation in a moment.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Alan Beatty and Patrice Hill in a moment.
Every weekend, C-SPAN 2 has 48 hours of nonfiction books and authors on Book TV. Sunday, C-SPAN 2 continues its live coverage of the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, with more authors, panel discussions, and call-in programs. Later, it's Afterwards, Financial Times World Trade Editor Alan Beatty, on why some countries are more financially prosperous than others. He's interviewed by Patrice Hill, Chief Economic Correspondent for the Washington Times. And Sunday, May 3rd, on In Depth, your calls for political satirist and author Christopher Buckley. Nonfiction books and authors every weekend on C-SPAN 2. For a complete program schedule, go to booktv.org.
Afterwards with Alan Beatty and Patrice Hill continues.
Welcome again to Book TV's Afterwards. Alan Beatty, you reached some very interesting and surprising and perhaps amusing conclusions about the influence of corruption on the world economy, in particular nations. You look at China, you look at India, you look at Tanzania, you look at Indonesia, and the surprising conclusion I found was that you found that corruption generally is not a great thing for an economy, but in some nations it works better than others, and there seems to be better forms of corruption and so can you just give us your thoughts and your ideas in this area?
Yeah, I knew this one was going to get me into trouble even when I was writing it. Yeah, I think everyone knows corruption is a bad idea, and over the last 10 or 15 years or so, there's been a lot more interest in the role of corruption in stopping poor countries get rich. You know, institutions like the World Bank never used to be able to talk about it at all, and then they've moved more and more into talking about it. But what I kind of found interesting is, you know, almost all countries have been corrupt at some point in their history. You know, Britain was unbelievably corrupt. 18th century English politics was astonishingly corrupt. Everyone knew it was. And whole empires have been built by corrupt colonial officials and so on. So what I wanted to try and do was say, you know, is it something about particular kinds of corruption or other bits of corruption? And the two countries I looked at in particular are Indonesia and Suharto, became president in the 1960s, and Tanzania under Julius Nyerere. Now, you know, Suharto is famous for being corrupt, and he was also, you know, let me make no bones about it, an unpleasant, blood-stained, murderous dictator. Julius Nyerere was a very decent man, by all accounts, very honest man, and so forth. But the corruption in Indonesia seemed to work a lot better, simply because it was so centralized. Essentially, it was just a form of tax, that Suharto controlled everything himself. He knew everything that was going on in the economy, and he restrained the amount of kickbacks that people were taking. And if you tried to take too much, you would be fired. And there were a couple of kind of famous occasions when people tried to exploit too much. The people who ran the docks, for example, in Indonesia, tried to take too much, and he summarily fired them all and brought in a foreign company instead. So you allowed so much, but no more. And what if corruption is centralized and organized and predictable, as I say, it essentially becomes a tax, you know, and taxes don't necessarily stop economies growing. Mm-hmm. Whereas what happened with Tanzania under Nyerere was that although he wasn't corrupt himself, he created this enormously complex system of state intervention in the economy, which created thousands and thousands of opportunities for lower level officials to enrich themselves and to be corrupt. And he had no means of controlling them whatsoever. And so the economy essentially ground to a halt. I mean, actually went into reverse. Not because he himself was a bad person, but because the way he ran the economy encouraged this disorganized, decentralized kind of corruption. And, you know, there's a difference between a sort of cream skimming corruption where you take 10 or 15% off the top, but basically leave the economy to run, and the kind of corruption, like the old TV game show Supermarket Sweep, you know, where you've got like a minute or 2 minutes to run around the supermarket just clearing everything you can and taking everything that's not nailed down and running off with it. And I think those are the differences between those two particular forms of corruption, and it's why, although corruption is not a good thing in itself, it can be much worse in one circumstance than another.
Yes, and you mentioned, if you look at the two rising Asian giants, China and India, once again you can make a distinction between the kind of corruption that a business might encounter in each one. China's been quite the success, especially in the manufacturing area, and yet they do have endemic corruption in their bureaucracy, in their government. But apparently it's a more efficient kind of corruption than what you encounter in India, where I guess there's just a whole lot more moving parts and confusion and so on. Can you get into that a bit?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the best explanation I heard on this was from a very senior official in the Indian government who I asked about it a few years ago and said, why is it that China gets so much more foreign direct investment than India does? And he said, well, foreign investors are scared out of India because of corruption. And I said, but what about China? Everyone knows that China is corrupt. And he kind of sighed a bit and said, yes. The thing with China is there's only one party to bribe. You've only got to get one guy on side, then you're fine. Whereas India and Indian politics, particularly as time has gone on, actually has splintered into this really kind of quite dysfunctional system of hundreds of small parties which are based on regions or castes or particular interest groups. And so getting anything done in any given area often involves, you know, bribing the government official in charge of it and the local party, and then the other party in the governing coalition, and then the party who will expose the first lot if you don't bribe them as well, and so forth. And so it's not, you know, it's not that they're corrupt or not corrupt, it's just some countries have streamlined their corruption and some countries have inefficient corruption.
Yes, we can see. One of the points you make, of course, technology affects the world economy and our wealth, our potential for wealth quite a bit. We've seen that very much in the last century, how technologies really affect our economic livelihood. And one of the points you make is about it seems like an arcane point, and yet it seems so important in retrospect, which was the development of the container, standard container, which is now used on railroads, ships, the same size containers, and how this really revolutionized world trade. I gather what you're saying is that if this was developed around the early 70s and was adopted during that period, and you really saw an explosion in world trade because of how much more efficiency you had in just the loading and unloading, the actual mechanics of getting goods from one market to another. Can you talk about that a bit and how?
Yeah, I mean, this is a story that's been well told by several authors, and the amounts of savings that were possible were absolutely astonishing. I mean, the amount of dropped by maybe 100-fold. The cost of shifting things around the world dropped maybe 100-fold, or to 100 because of the shipping container. But the thing I found interesting about it is that, in retrospect, as you see, it just seems so blindingly obvious. But even once people had kind of grasped the point of it, it took a decade or more actually to get this thing adopted, because the various shipping companies had all come up with their own versions of the shipping containers. The really critical thing is having the same size everywhere in the world. So every shipping container, every port is all organized around having what is now the 8 foot by 8 foot by 20 foot, or 8 foot by 8 foot by 40 foot container. And the detail of this at the time, one of the big companies involved, they had a 35-foot container because their big port was in New Jersey, and that was the biggest container you were allowed in New Jersey. Another one had, I think, a 24-foot container because their main cargo was tinned pineapple and canned pineapple from Hawaii, and that was literally the biggest container that you could fill with canned pineapple without it being too heavy. There was yet another company that only had a 17-foot container because they did lots of business with Latin America, and they had to truck these things around kind of winding mountain roads. And so it took years and years and years to bang all these people's heads together and get them to say, we need one sized container. And in the end, as often, it was the government that had to come in and do it. And as also often actually in America, it was the government with a national security and defense rationale who came in to do it. It was the Federal Maritime Board that handed out federal subsidies for shipbuilding. And they said, they just said, okay, we're not going to hand out any subsidies unless it is around this new standard container size. And that had the effect of, just like that, of getting everyone to adopt the same size. So, just because a technology comes up and just because it seems so obvious and so much better doesn't mean it's going to be adopted. A lot of the time you need to overcome kind of entrenched interest in the way things have already been done, and often it takes a government to do that.
Mm-hmm. Was it because the United States adopted the standard and we are the biggest importer, I guess, and maybe still one of the biggest exporters? Was that really a critical
That was one of the most critical ways of doing it. It was also then adopted by the US military itself, and then the Vietnam War and other things like this. Actually, one of the few good things to come out of the Vietnam War was the kind of spread of containerization around the world. So yes, certainly the US played a critical, it wasn't the only thing, but certainly the US played a critical role in that.
Well, Mr. Beatty has tremendous knowledge of the whole history of the economy around the world, and I think we are in one of the most difficult economic times in our lifetime right now. And interesting to know how you would apply the lessons of history, what we've learned, what that works, what doesn't work, and how you would apply it to our current circumstances. How are we doing as far as our response to this deep financial crisis and economic downturn?
I think some countries are doing better than others. Some countries have learnt the lessons, and some people within some countries are doing better than others. Just to start with the bad things first, I think a lot of continental European countries, for example Germany, really haven't grasped the nature of the crisis that we're in. I think they still think we're fighting an inflationary challenge such as that we saw in the 1970s with the oil shock, or in Germany's case at the end of the 1980s with the reunification of Germany. And they've still got this obsession with sound money and keeping debt low and so forth, which I don't think is the right response at all. I think this is essentially a 1930s type crisis, and that the real risk is deflation, and what countries should be doing is those that can afford it should be pumping as much stimulus into their economy as they can, and indeed intervening aggressively to rescue the financial system. And I think you saw this recently with the Group of 20 meeting. You know, when France and Germany, one of their main obsessions seemed to be going after offshore tax centres and tax havens. Now, you know, that may or may not be a good thing in itself, but I've not seen a convincing explanation of how offshore tax centres had a whole lot to do with the current financial crisis. And my favourite metaphor of this was someone who's involved in the G20 process said, this is a bit like a bar fight, isn't it? It's a bit like a bar brawl. You know, you wait till the fight breaks out, then you take a swing at the guy you've always wanted to hit. But whether he had anything at all to do with starting the fight is not the issue. So I don't think those countries have got it particularly. I think the US is closer to having got it, and certainly the current administration is closer to having got it. Some elements of Congress I'm not quite so sure about. But the twin approaches of pumping stimulus into the economy and intervening aggressively to sort out the financial system, I certainly think the response is better than it was in the 1930s. I mean, I certainly think we've learned that. I haven't seen anyone suggesting we go back to the gold standard. I haven't seen anyone seriously suggesting that we should try to be balancing our budget at this particular time. If it were me, I think we should, if anything, go even more aggressively, and I'd like to see more aggressive intervention in the financial system. And it's not clear to me whether or not the administration would like to do that and they're being restrained by Congress, or whether they don't think that kind of going in and taking over banks wholesale is a sensible thing to do at the moment. But certainly I think we've learned some of the lessons back from the 1930s. And one lesson we do seem to have learned, or I'm fairly optimistic about, is actually the issue about protectionism. Because, you know, you hear a lot about protectionism, and I write a lot about protectionism. But really, even the protectionist moves we've seen so far, which are worrying, are nothing like the kind of wholesale retreat into isolation that we saw in the 1930s. And, you know, some of the laws and the rules and the systems that were put in after the 1930s, the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which then became the WTO, I think have constrained us from making some of the same mistakes that we made back then. So, you know, I'd give some countries better marks than others, but in general, I think we've certainly shown quite a few of the signs of having learned the lessons of the past.
You mentioned, and everyone agrees, that dealing with the huge trillion-dollar losses in the financial sector is the key to weathering this crisis and getting the economy back on its feet. And yet that has been the hardest part for the United States. The stimulus bill passed almost like greased lightning, and so fast that, you know, if you blinked, you missed it. But we are struggling to get in place a system, government intervention program to deal with the monumental losses at banks. It does seem to be primarily a political problem, and I don't know how this jives with recent history. Some people point to Japan and the problems that it had dealing with its, they called zombie banks in Japan, and a lot of it apparently was because there was very little public support for putting money into these banks. That's the fundamental problem we have in the United States. Is this an area we could really stumble and hurt ourselves and reverse some of our progress?
Yes, I think it's a real problem. I think, you know, there's a lot of legitimate anger. I mean, you know, absolutely, you know, accurate, legitimate anger about what certain banks and the financial sector as a whole has been doing. But the wrong lesson to draw from that is we're not going to give them any money at all, we won't do anything to them at all we're going to do is try and punish them. Because although that, you know, that may be kind of comforting in the short term and may deliver, you know, political rewards in the short term, I think if it leads into the sense that we will never put any more money into the financial rescue, that could be kind of quite a damaging thing to do. And I think, you know, anger is all very well. Anger is quite justified, but I think the accurate thing to do is to try and channel that anger into having a sensible reform program now, and actually try and channel it further down the line into ensuring that we have regulation that means that this doesn't happen again. But allowing this sort of pitchfork rebellion attitude to simply mean we will never give another cent of public money to Wall Street, I think is quite damaging.
Yes, that's certainly the very issue that we have today, in the United States. Another issue that I think Americans worry about is the huge debts that we have. And so far, our response, we are the largest debtor in the world now, and we are dependent on money coming in from outside the United States to finance our debts, our national debt, and our trade deficits. A big part of our response has been to go even deeper into debt, and that makes a lot of people feel uneasy. We are now having budget deficits of over $1 trillion for years to come are projected. We're running at almost a $2 trillion rate right now. These are just unheard of. I mean, $2 trillion is the size of whole economies, even in the developed world. And that's how much we're running of a deficit this year. And this is all to finance our stimulus, our banking rescue program, and just generally the recession. Are we in danger here of making a historic mistake?
In running short-term deficits, no, I don't think so. Because I think the way to reduce deficits in the longer term is to get the economy going again. If I were trying to bring America down, what I would do at this point is say, you should do nothing, you should just let the financial system collapse. And, the economy could be in recession for 10 or 15 years. Sure, you'll have slightly smaller deficits in the longer term, but you'll have bigger deficits in the shorter term, but you'll have bigger deficits in the longer term. I think these are precisely the times when countries like the US should be running deficits. One of the things that you do in building up policy credibility year after year and decade after decade is that when you have times like this, you can indeed run deficits. The problem has been that the US has been running deficits in good times as well, and I think it's ironic that a lot of the people currently complaining about deficits in the short term are the same ones who voted for the tax cuts and the spending increases that have been building up kind of medium-term deficits even in good times. So it's a very difficult argument to make, and I can understand why people are worried about debt. But I think the most important thing is do what has to be done now in this time of extraordinary crisis. And at the same time, try and set in place policies that will return the budget towards balance and will return the budget towards medium-term sustainability. But trying to do that by cutting back on spending this year or next year, I think will end up costing more in the longer run.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that at times of crisis, and you look back at history going back 1,000 or more years, that is when the decisions are made often. The definitive decisions are made that affect the course of history in a country, that affect whether people will be rich or poor in the future. And particularly in the U.S., we have been successful at negotiating crises in the past and making the adjustments that were necessary. You were emphasizing how flexibility and the willingness to adjust and make the changes that are needed to weather the crisis and to prevent it from happening again. What kind of adjustments are needed today in the U.S. and the world economy generally to get through? You've mentioned what we need to get through the crisis now, but in the long run, how should our system change so as to ensure there's no crisis like this again and that we maintain prosperity?
In the longer term, the financial services sector needs to be returned to its proper function, which is providing finance for the rest of the economy. And in particular, you can't get into the situation where financial institutions are simultaneously too big to fail and are taking huge risks, getting involved in risky assets that they can't, that they don't understand, and essentially hoping or expecting that the government will bail them out. So I'm not quite sure we need to go back to the old system of very strict division between commercial banking and investment banking, but certainly there needs to be a recognition that banking as a utility to help the rest of the economy is a different thing from people taking bets on the way particular financial assets will go, which again is to some extent redoing some of what was done in the 1930s, and possibly that we've moved too far away from. So that's one of the most important things. I think the other important thing is putting the US public finances on a sustainable path. And one of the things that happened throughout the 1990s is that, more and more liabilities were added. The liabilities of Medicare were increased, and nothing was done to reform them. Nothing was done on Social Security. The reaction to every problem seemed to be a tax cut. And there was just simply no sense of how this was ever going to get back into a balance in the medium term. So I think those two are the most important things that the US can kind of do by and of itself. Globally, what needs to happen, of course, is that the world economy needs to be rebalanced. The US cannot continue always being the consumer of last resort, and countries like China can't continue always exporting their way, and Germany, in fact, can't always continue exporting their way out of problems. So there needs to be a rebalancing of global demand away from the US and towards the surplus countries like China and Germany.
Well, that's what seemed to be the hard part, in the sense that how do you get people to start spending in the middle of a big recession, or in the case of, say, China, a big slowdown where they're losing jobs as well as we are. If you're going to rebalance the economy, that's essentially what has to happen. Instead of depending on American consumers to pull the world out, which may end up happening actually, the idea is to try to get the rest of the world to sort of have more balanced economies, and ourselves included, going back to savings. One of the points you make, which is interesting historically, especially at this time, is that at one time the U.S. was a creditor nation. We did save, and we were the ones that helped Europe pull itself up after the World Wars, and helped them. And that was actually a key reason, isn't it, that we came to be the world's big power in the last century, because we were in a position to help like that. So how did we get to be from a creditor nation like that to a debtor nation? That's a trend that I don't remember you touching on in your book, and I think that's an issue, as you say, one of the big issues we have to address in the future in the world, and in the present crisis. How do you get people to change their saving habits and their spending habits? What needs to be done here?
Well, part of the problem is that, in a sense, certainly in kind of recent decades, in a sense, countries like China were just kept shoveling money at the US. They kept intervening against their own currency, and building up vast reserves with the deliberate aim of affecting the value of their own currency and encouraging their own exports. And there was at least as much kind of push as pull, as it were. And one of the reasons that the US stopped saving so much is that essentially China was saving on its behalf and then lending them the money. So what needs to be done is that needs to be rebalanced, and that will be done through a combination of US households rebuilding their own balance sheets and beginning to save more. But it will also be done by those countries which are in surplus changing their behavior. It's both sides have to act. It's not just a question of the countries that have been running deficits that are the ones to blame. And actions need to be taken on both fronts. And you were saying, how are these other countries going to do this consuming? Well, yes, and you're quite right. It's hard to get their consumers to consume that much at the moment, in which case it falls to the governments to do it. And that is precisely why the Chinese and the Germans should be pumping a lot of stimulus into their own economy with the hope that one of the things that will do is help to rebalance the world economy along the way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Are we making, I gather you're saying we're not really making too much progress in that area, although it's not the front burner item right now, but it's
in some ways it should be the front burner item. I think we're doing better with some countries than others. I don't think we're doing particularly well with Germany. China, you're never quite sure, because you're never quite sure how much of these announced Chinese stimulus does actually exist, or whether it's double counting or triple counting or something. And I must say, one thing that the Chinese government certainly seems to have learned in its conversations with Western governments is how to spin spending announcements, and how to announce the same bit of spending 2 or 3 times. So,
yes.
So how much of this actually materializes, we'll wait and see.
Well, there's an issue too. This current crisis, some people have a feeling, China has been in ascendance for some time, quickly rising to be the world's third largest economy, and certainly has the potential to unseat the United States as the world's largest economy. Could that be one of the outcomes of the current episode with the United States economy now shrinking at a 5% rate or more, and China still growing at more than 5%?
It could, but I mean, China's economy has been so dependent on export demand for so long that, in a sense, they're not in an enormously strong position either. I always kind of think of China and the US as a bit like a kind of dysfunctional marriage. You know, they exchange a lot of rude words, but they're kind of dependent on each other as well. And it is actually hard. I mean, it's genuinely hard for an economy like China, which has spent so long encouraging its export industries and having these, you know, world-class, often foreign investment-driven export industries on the coast, and on their entire economy oriented, or a lot of their economy oriented around that. It's kind of difficult for them suddenly to shift from that to being a domestic spending economy. You know, these people can't kind of instantly leave the factories and become care workers or whatever else is needed in kind of inland China. And so, you know, China needs the US, and China needs US demand. And the other issue that's been talked about recently is this issue of a new global currency, a new global reserve currency, and so forth. You know, this is something that the Chinese themselves have brought up. But China is, again, in this, is kind of arguing from a position of weakness or a position of dependence, which is they've built up these vast dollar reserves themselves. They're worried about a fall in the value of those assets, because that means they take a big hit as well. And it's something that, so, you know, a shift to a reserve currency could have painful consequences for them as well. So,
thank you very much,
so
Alan.
those economies actually depend on each other as much as they compete.
Yes, that's very interesting that the future of the world currency as well seems to be at stake in this. Thank you so much, Alan, for your insights and very thoughtful presentation of the world history of the economy. We thank you very much for appearing on the show.
Thank you.
Poor developing world today, whereas the United States became the biggest, richest economy on earth. Can you kind of go through that and how all of that happened, starting with from the very beginning?
Sure, and in some ways it's even more dramatic than that. It's not just Argentina was always poor and stayed poor, but that Argentina became rich, and that between the wars, Argentina was one of the 10 richest economies on earth. And then it fell. It's, as the old saying goes, it's just about the only economy that's ever managed to get from the third world to the first and then back again. So the question is, why did it do that? Well, from the beginning, the way in which Argentina developed and the way in which it settled its frontier was very different from the US. As you say, both of them are very similar. They have these big fertile grasslands, you know, the pampas and the prairie. But the US did it in a kind of quite entrepreneurial way. It parceled out land to small amounts of land to entrepreneurial farmers who really wanted to make a go of it and increase productivity. Argentina, possibly because of the legacy of being part of the Spanish Empire, essentially recreated a kind of European landowning aristocracy in the New World. They parceled out huge swathes of land, often fairly arbitrarily, often to military officers who'd done the conquering, but they didn't necessarily want to farm it. They weren't that interested in farming it or doing anything kind of innovative with it. All they really did was to encircle huge swathes of it with barbed wire and turn it over to pasture. And so that was kind of one of the early missteps that Argentina did, and from then on, Argentina began to be kind of run by a fairly small kind of oligarchy, a small landowning oligarchy. They weren't very interested in industrializing. They weren't very interested in saving their own money and investing it in industry. And while the US had this sort of go-ahead entrepreneurial class who saved their own money, certainly they borrowed it from abroad, and they imported, you know, technology and know-how from Britain and elsewhere. But they were very interested in whatever the newest thing was and industrializing, and Argentina really wasn't. And that was the first kind of initial misstep, I think, that put Argentina on a different path to the US. And then for a while that was kind of masked. The big differences between the two weren't that obvious, because Argentina was just doing so well pumping out food exports, you know, the wheat and the beef and so forth. But all it really was a glorified export zone. It wasn't really a kind of, you know, standalone economy on its own. the Brits poured money and expertise into Argentina, but all they really wanted to do was just get out the wheat and get out the beef. They didn't really want to kind of build the country up. And then when the Great Depression hit, that affected Argentina enormously, because of course it was agricultural trade that was one of the biggest things to be hit, one of the biggest casualties of the Great Depression. And then where the US kind of renewed itself and democracy was tested but survived, and the federal government changed some of the things it did, and so forth, Argentina unfortunately slid into dictatorship, and it slid also into isolationism. And the idea that Argentina came away with from the Great Depression was entirely the wrong one. It was basically, we relied on the rest of the world let us down, we're not going to do that anymore. What we're going to do is build ourselves up behind tariff walls, we're going to cut ourselves off, we're going to be, isolationist, and we're going to be self-sufficient. And that really was not a recipe for becoming a rich country. And that's the moment at which some of the early mistakes that Argentina made became very obvious, and Argentina began to slide from the third world to the first world back to the third.
Yes, that is what's fascinating, is I think a lot of people don't even realize Argentina was one of the top 10 richest countries in the world like a century ago, and lost its place because of some bad decisions made during the, I guess primarily you're saying the Great Depression was sort of the... Welcome to Book TV's Afterwards. Alan Beatty, eminent journalist and economist and historian as well, has written a fascinating book sort of covering everything from ancient Egypt to the current times, and in the economic trends that have prevailed and have taken hold. And I think he finds quite a few things that are common with today and ancient Egypt and even ancient Rome. And it's a fascinating book. The title of the book, False Economy, that's the part that actually kind of puzzles me the most, and I thought I would just ask you, why did you write the book, and what is the meaning of the title?
Well, the meaning of the title, and the title, as often with books, is pretty much the last thing we came up with, was because I think there were lots of false ideas that go around about the economy, and a lot of false ideas that have gone around about human history. The most prominent one being that things that were going to happen are always inevitable, that we are where we are, and there's nothing really very much we can do about it. Some countries are rich, some countries are poor, and that's just the way things are. Some countries are always destined to be rich, and some countries are always destined to be poor. And I kind of regard that as a false economy of thought. And I think it's one of the problems when you're just trying to explain where things are at the moment, to say, well, let's look back into history, let's explain why we've got things are, and then, okay, that was it. There's nothing that anyone could have done about it anywhere along. So really what I was trying to challenge is the idea that economic history is destiny, or economic history is fate, and that we can't control. We couldn't have controlled the past, and that we can't control the future.
Well, you do an excellent job with that. I think making very clear what is kind of baked in the cake, and that we are given when we start out, but also what kind of choices are made, and those who make the good choices and those who make the bad choices. His first chapter, I think, is one of particular interest to Americans, because it sort of asks a question that I think probably has occurred to a lot of people in this country. Why did we turn out so different from South America? And you take the example of Argentina. Essentially, the two continents were discovered at roughly the same time, and they had the same blank sheet, blank page to be written on by the Europeans who came. The United States has fertile land, arable land, and wonderful resources, but so did Argentina and Brazil and so on. And so you discuss why it is that Argentina ended up being still part of the